All right, let's talk about Achilles injuries, which is not the most fun thing to talk about, but I think this is actually a really interesting topic to make a video on because, it's something we hear a lot about is, especially with the way that, Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers both tore their Achilles this past season and are now trying to come back this upcoming season. The question is, how good will they be? And while I think a lot of people will say, these kind of injuries, medical advancement has gotten so strong, they don't really bother me anymore. Well, I've heard that narrative, but what I like to do on this channel is sometimes challenge narratives and do my own, not to borrow a phrase from Aaron Rodgers, but do my own research on some of this stuff and figure out, is it actually true? Well, let's get into it. I went back and looked at a lot of players who have had Achilles injuries, and it's actually a little bit tougher to find data on that than you might realize. There isn't just like a list of every NFL player with Achilles injuries, so you kind of have to search and keep going back. So I undoubtedly missed some guys, but I went back the past 6 or 7 years or so, finding every player I could that has had an Achilles injury, and I just wanted to see how good did they end up being after recovering from the injury? So what I want to check is, did you play well, as well as you had played before the injury? These are the 5 categories that we're going to be talking about here. These are the 5 categories that I checked. So first, did you just return to the NFL? Have you played what I'm going to consider significant playing time, over 100 snaps is my, because some people came in and played like 9 snaps, not counting that. But if you've played over 100 snaps, that counts as a return. And also, I should mention, I am excluding players who retired after an Achilles injury. So if that was your, if your last time in the NFL and you're kind of older, and I'm not counting that because you might have retired anyways. So there's also, the other 4 are play just as well. So did you play just as well as you had prior to the injury? So at some point I use PFF data, at some point after the injury, did you have a season that was kind of around where you typically would have? And I was lenient on the players in that aspect. Then there's the instantly play just as well. The year after coming off of the injury, did you come back and play just as well as you usually play? Then there's the never play just as well. And finally, never/barely play again. Those are the 5 categories that I put everybody into. So first, 76.2% of players returned to the NFL. Now, some of the players that did not return maybe were kind of, no one was like a fringe NFL player that I was able to get into data. These were all usually starters or players. I only used players who had significant playing time prior to the injuries. So this is actually maybe not the, the good number you think it is. I mean, 25% straight up just don't play again, or maybe only have a little bit. There are players who I would say were like good players that ended up straight up like not playing much at all. Like Brandon Brooks is an example where I think he had just under the 100 snaps cutoff after this, and he was someone who was a great player for Philadelphia prior to that injury. This is the crazy stat. Just 19% played just as well at any point after their injury. And again, you can maybe argue small sample size with a couple of these guys, but still, very few are ending up being who they were before the injury. That is the exception, not the rule. And the players who instantly just play just as well, for them, we are talking just 14.3% of the players ended up the next year after an Achilles injury playing, having a year that was kind of what they are used to doing. So that is by far and away the exception. That is something that very rarely happens, and it's not something you should expect. As for players who straight up just never played as well after the injury, we're looking at an 81% chance of never being what you once were, which is, again, and it should be clear in that this is, definitely not perfectly exact, these numbers, but I think would be in the ballpark. I imagine if you did your own study, it's going to be very similar to these numbers. Might be off a little bit, but yeah, that's very scary if you're someone who's coming off an Achilles injury. 23.8% would never or barely, I spelled barely wrong, that's a bad job by me, barely play again. Again, very, very scary stuff there, as you're looking at essentially having a higher likelihood once you get an Achilles injury of never playing, never playing or barely playing again. You pretty much have the same odds of that, actually higher odds of that than ever having a season like you had prior to it. So while the odds of getting back to the NFL tend to be pretty high, the odds of getting back to once were is very low. And this does vary position by position. And I think the question a lot of people are going to have is, listen, well, there's a lot of guys coming off of Achilles injuries that we want to see play well again, and that's something that's concerning. And these numbers are certainly concerning if you do have, someone on your favorite team is coming off of an Achilles injury. The quarterbacks are definitely going to get the biggest attention, right? As guys like Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins coming off of Achilles injuries. And let's be honest, Aaron Rodgers is going to get the most attention, right? He's the main guy people are going to be talking about with this. Can he play again? Well, let's just talk about Aaron Rodgers for a second. How do quarterbacks match up in this data? Well, actually, out of all this data, I didn't find a single quarterback recently. It's possible I just missed someone, but I didn't find a single quarterback since doing this that made the data. So there are no quarterbacks here, which maybe makes you take a little sigh of relief if you're a Jets fan of, okay, well, that's good. And obviously, a lot of these positions are very dependent on how explosive you can be, and just getting a little bit explosive could be the complete difference in you being an NFL player and not being an NFL player. Again, these are the best of the best out here, right? So, losing a little bit of an edge can be all it takes. For a quarterback, Aaron Rodgers has already been losing kind of his mobility for a while now, right? He's an older player. That's not really what makes him special as of right now. He's definitely much more of a pocket passer than he was when he was younger. I think if this happened when he was 27, you'd maybe say, okay, well, that's concerning about the leg stuff. At this point, we know he can play even if he isn't totally mobile. Now, again, it is worth mentioning, though, that you use your whole body when you throw the football. It's not just using your arms, but it's not quite the same as, a running back, for example. The one comparison you can look at, and I'm sure a Jets fan has probably already written this in the comments, the one thing you look at is Dan Marino. Dan Marino had an Achilles injury. He played just as well after the Achilles injury, and right away, he played just as well after the Achilles injury. So that's what you're hoping for. There definitely is precedent of quarterbacks coming through and being successful after the Achilles injury. So again, even if somebody's numbers are scary, hey, there still is 14% that played just as well right after the injury. So it's not a death sentence by any means. It's just, and it also is worth mentioning, we are continuing to get better with medical advancement, right? Like, using Aaron Rodgers, he had one of the best surgeons, I guess, that there is out there who, who was that could be really impactful for him in trying to beat the not so good odds. But as a whole, in doing this data, I actually, again, kind of stepping back from Aaron Rodgers now, this does concern me a lot about certain guys. And if I was running an NFL organization, I probably just straight up wouldn't re-sign someone if they're coming off an Achilles injury at a skill position, unless it's a situation where it's just a great value that's just totally worth taking a flyer, because I think that's a real concern. It does feel like, going through and looking at these players, I was like, oh yeah, there's so many players. Like O.J. Howard. O.J. Howard's a perfect example. Oh yeah, what happened to O.J. Howard? Well, he got an Achilles injury and was never the same. Shaq Barrett. What happened to Shaq Barrett? He got an Achilles injury and was never the same. There's so many players that you can look at throughout, and it's oh yeah, that's Tre'Davious White, another guy who has not looked the same since coming back. It happens. It does happen. And hopefully for some of these guys, they'll be able to beat the odds. But it's a scary thing that kind of maybe we don't talk about as much as we should. So in doing this data, in doing this video, it actually was disappointing to see that how tough it is to overcome it. But I guess all that much more impressive for the guys who are able to, or maybe it's a combination of impressive and luck. I don't know. But yeah, interesting stuff. But yeah, that's what I think about all of it. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from ya. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.